Hey, what's up? It's Phoenix, and welcome back to my YouTube channel. I'm super stoked because today I'm going to talk about the philosophical themes of The Magic Mountain, which was a German 20th century novel written by Thomas Mann. And I'm super stoked to be able to talk about it. So without further ado, let's dive right in. I will acknowledge that there are spoilers ahead. So without further ado, let's dive right in. I recently read The Magic Mountain by Thomas Mann, which is a very long and complicated book, which is about 700 pages. And this book is really interesting for a variety of reasons. And I would like to talk about some of the philosophical themes of this work. Now, one of the main themes is that of politics, religion, and culture, which very much prominently features in this book. And they are mediated by the main character, Hans Castorp, who is what you could describe a very mediocre, average individual. And whether or not we utilize that criticism of this character, it is the way that Thomas Mann himself writes about this character. But here's the thing, is that if this is a novel of ideas, and it is what we could call the attempt at being a great novel, a great work of art, what is interesting is to consider that the idea is that Thomas Mann is writing about Hans Castorp in the context of a sweeping history or a sweeping work of art. And so I was always struck by that idea because it seems to me to convey that Hans Castorp might actually have a little bit more of the grand and remarkable in him than we realize, even if he is described as being mediocre and average, as not being a great man or someone who can himself identify the ideas of the time and the spirit of the time to be able to convey the grand ideas that are happening in a sweeping view of history. And I just love that juxtaposition, because I thought it was an interesting way of characterizing Hans Castorp as the main character, as the protagonist of this otherwise sweeping, great German novel. Now, the book is big on ideas. It goes everywhere from talking about religion, culture, and politics to talking about philosophy, such as the philosophy of time or existentialism, as the book is indebted to Friedrich Nietzsche, who was another German writer. It also describes very large themes of sickness, death, and health, and medicine. There are passages about medicine and the body, which goes into a long analysis of blood and the human body in a very scientific way that was very up to date at the time, to just dealing with general ideas of the mundane and of human experience. And I think that that is a remarkable way of capturing the panorama of existence itself and the background of human civilization and human life. And I believe that this is why this is a great novel. But there are two characters who I would say are, in my mind, the most influential and influenced my reading of the book, which is Settembrini, which is one character, as well as Nafta. And they're constantly discoursing about religion and politics and culture because they are coming from two very opposite sides of poles of culture itself, and they have very different views. So I'll start with Settembrini, who you could describe as being a liberal humanist, who talks a lot about the importance of tolerance and democracy and humanism and of respecting human life, coming from a secular point of view, and therefore being able to capture a lot of how we see liberalism as it is practiced even up to today, a century later. Then there is Nafta, who you could describe as someone who was very radical in his views of supporting radicalism, and his views are definitely difficult views because it does seem to be that his views are super fundamentalist in a traditional sense, as well as imitating views of intolerance and imitating views that are very much difficult to articulate in the context of a more liberal worldview. And it seems as though NAFTA and Settembrini are constantly at war with each other, for lack of a better phrase, because they see the world in a different way. And I always thought that that was an interesting way of capturing the tension between very specific liberal and religious views that are very much opposed from each other. And so the thing that I think is interesting is that Hans Castorp is constantly listening to these conversations. Settembrini is often condescending to Hans Castorp, as if Hans doesn't understand these ideas. And yet, Hans Castorp seems to be the kind of interlocutor of these views because he is constantly listening to them and engaging with their conversations. And so, the interesting thing to take away from this is the philosophical import of such views, of such characterization, of such views of the time, which I do think captures the tension that we constantly experience in religion, politics, and culture, because we are constantly at odds with each other. In America, at least, we have never been so divisive. There have never been so many competing ideologies and things that are competing for our attention. But what's interesting is that this book was written a century before now, and it is very interesting to see how such views capture the tension that people often have between each other. And the reality is that no matter how much you try to have your own tolerance or tolerant views, we are often at odds with each other. And so even though there is a kind of philosophical neutrality with the way the ideas are presented, there is very much a lot that is at stake and a lot that is competing for our attention, even now, even as we live in a different culture. And I think that that's a very fascinating theme, because I don't think we often realize that there are views that are presented in society and by other people in our lives and in society itself that are opposed with each other and that often fight against each other. And so even though Settembrini is set on tolerance and democracy, he is very much at odds with other views that are expressed throughout this book. And I think it's important to note this, which is that it is very difficult to be tolerant whenever we are experiencing views that contradict our own. And so while it makes sense where we might want to identify with our own views, it is impossible to be objective, because these things get to the heart of our identity, whether they are radical views or not. And in that way, I think to capture this philosophical tension between these two characters specifically, but also the characters throughout the book, it makes sense that philosophically we are very much at odds with each other. And there are a lot of views that we experience and that we encounter that run counter to our own views and what we really believe. And I think that's a remarkable theme. Nonetheless, what I get out of Thomas Mann's approach is that we can still nonetheless try for a more objective view. Hans Castorp may be the most ordinary individual ever, but he's also the main character. And so obviously these conversations and these grand battles that are taking place in an ideological and philosophical sense affect us. And they affect even the most normal individual. And there is, interestingly enough, a kind of greatness and grandness in that realization, which is that Hans Castorp is listening to these conversations and trying to decide for himself, and therefore he is elevated to a superior status of being able to experience the world in a grand and remarkable way. And so I do think that the ideas themselves in this book are far from ordinary. The characters are far from ordinary. And I find that to be a really remarkable thing to extrapolate from this book. It reminds me of characters like Gavroche from Les Miserables. Gavroche, who was a minor character and yet has a major role in the long, complex 1400 book of Les Miserables, as well as recognizing that even the minor characters or the most unexpected and ignored characters are actually the ones that affect civilization the most. And I just love that theme. I don't think that this juxtaposition was accidental in Thomas Mann, because I remember being struck by the very descriptions at the beginning of the book that Hans Castorp is an ordinary character, and that ultimately he is someone who is grand through his understanding of the world. But this is what's interesting, is even in the grand sweeping history of the world, Hans Castorp is ordinary. He's an unscripted, undescribed, unsung hero of World War I. And it's very sad to think about it in the context of his fate being unresolved, so maybe he lives in the war, maybe he dies, but as being virtually or literally unknown, even though we've just been following his thoughts written through the writing of Thomas Mann throughout this entire 700-page book. And so it's very interesting to have a very unresolved fate, a very unsung fate, and yet to have such an important role in this book, which is a sweeping history. I just think that that's a remarkable theme. So ultimately, what do I get out of these philosophical themes of Thomas Mann's book, The Magic Mountain? That is a very good question. I think ultimately what I take away is this idea that ideas should be examined. This is a novel of ideas, that is the subtitle of this book, and it is a very big book, and it does deal with a lot of ideas. It's not just about language, it's not just about art, it's about the philosophical and intellectual tides that sweep through history and that have an influence on all of us. This kind of overwhelming force of history and this overwhelming force of culture. And I think it just gives me pause. It helps me to recognize that the world is bigger than I will ever realize. It helps me to recognize my own small role in reality, but even with what I've said about Hans Castorp as being such an important character in this book, even if he's written off by society, it is still nonetheless powerful to remember that we do have a role, and that ideas do influence us, and our ideas do matter, even if it doesn't seem like it in this overwhelming reality that we find ourselves in. And so, to see the remarkable influences of this book, I mentioned Friedrich Nietzsche as an example, but also Henry Bergson, who wrote a lot about time, the influence of Einstein's theory of relativity, which is starting to become more and more of an influence during this time period, as well as other German influences, and such as the Tales of the Brothers Grimm. It's just very remarkable to think about all of these influences and the way that culture is this sweeping thing that is always happening over us like a tide, and that is always there. And it just gives me pause. It makes me realize that there's a lot more to life than I will ever realize, that ideas are just so powerful, and that philosophical views might be expressed philosophically, but they still have an import and impact on our lives that is far from neutral. And so it just gives me pause to think about what I really believe, to think about what I think about, to think about what I really believe and think about, and to try to understand history and society and culture through the lens of this book, but also through my own lens, even if I am, as you could say, a minor character who is being judged by Settembrini, for example, this character who thinks that you don't understand these complex philosophical and intellectual ideas. No, of course we understand them. We internalize them. We see what is at stake. We see what is really going on in the world. And so, yeah, that is my thought on the philosophical ideas of this book. I hope that you will check out the book. I hope that you will be able to sit with it for a long period of time the way that I did, and to be able to let the ideas set in. And I hope that you'll give it a shot. I'm Phoenix, and I'm super excited that I got to share my thoughts about this wonderful book, and that even though it took a lot of time and was very literary and complicated and grand, I'm very glad that I got to read it. And I think that you will get some interesting things from this book if you decide to read it, or even read only part of it. So yeah, I'm Phoenix, thank you for watching, and I hope that you will check out other videos on my channel, as well as other reviews that I've done of books, and of other talks that I've done on books that I've read, and I hope that you'll check them out. I'm Phoenix, thank you for watching, and I will see you next time.